Hey everyone, happy Monday. Today we are going to be jumping right into a new unit. We are starting this skeletal system today. And then after we finish the skeletal system, we will be talking about the muscular system and then the integumentary system, which is our skin. And the reason that these three things all relate to each other is because they all fall under the category of our body support systems. So your skeleton, your muscles, and your skin all work together to support and protect the body. So first, we are going to be talking today about the structures of the skeletal system. Hopefully by now you already watched the crash course video on the skeletal system and answered some guided questions, so you kind of have an introduction as to what we are talking about, and now we are going to go ahead and get started. So let's start with what is the skeletal system. It is the system that provides support and allows us to move. It is made up of our bones, also known as osseous tissue, which protects soft body parts, produces blood cells, and acts as a storage unit for minerals and fat. Your body is composed of 206 bones in the average adult skeleton, along with cartilage, ligaments, and joints, which we're going to be talking about. Remember that ligaments are what attach bone to bone. So when we're talking about bone classifications, we have many different types of bones. The first one are your long bones. These are the ones that are found in your arms and legs and support your weight and facilitate movement. Examples of long bones might be things like your humerus, your ulna, your radius, your tibia, and your fibula. Next, we have your short bones, and your short bones are things that are equal in width and length. So they're very small typically and short, and they are found mostly within your wrist and within your ankles. And their main job is to provide stability. Your flat bones are much thinner and often flat, hence the name, or maybe slightly curved. And they tend to look kind of like a plate, and these would include things that are found in your skull, your ribs, and your sternum, which is that breastbone in the center of the chest. And these are all important because they protect your internal organs. And then lastly, we have your irregular bones. And your irregular bones are odd in shape, which is why they're called irregular. And they include things like your hip bone or your vertebrae in your spinal column. And they also are there to protect your internal organs. And then off to the side here, you can see pictures of what each of those look like. Next, let's talk about your bone anatomy. First, we have your diaphysis. Your diaphysis is the region between two epiphyses, which means that this big, long section here in the middle of the bone, that is your diaphysis. Next, you have your epiphysis. And your epiphyses are at either end of the bone, and they are formed by an increase in the size of both ends of your long bone. So on the photo here, you can see up here, you have your proximal epiphysis, and this means proximal because it is closer to the attachment point. So if we were looking at the tibia, that is located on the leg, and then the top of it that attaches to the hip, that would be the proximal point because that's what attaches to that hip. So that would be your proximal epiphysis, and then down at the bottom, further away from your hip, you have your distal epiphysis. Next, you have your medullary canal. This is the hollow area that acts as a storage area for bone marrow. So here in the middle, we can see that the bone has been kind of carved out, and there's a yellow bone marrow in the center. That medullary canal or medullary cavity is the area that holds your bone marrow. Next, we have our endosteum. Your endosteum is a thin layer of connective tissue that lines the inside of that medullary cavity. So the medullary cavity is hollow, and then there's a liner that fills the inside of it. That would be your endosteum. Next, you have your periosteum. And your periosteum is a tough and fibrous connective tissue, much tougher than the endosteum, that covers the outside of the bone. It contains different lymph vessels, nerves, and blood vessels, which help to transport blood and nutrients and nurture your bone cells. This also acts as an anchor point for ligaments and tendons. So on the outside of your bone, you have a thin layer of this connective tissue that holds, all your blood vessels. It provides circulation to your bones in order to get nutrients to your bones, because whether you realize it or not, your bones are living cells in your body just like everything else, and they have to receive nutrients just like everything else as well. And then lastly, we have your articular cartilage. And your articular cartilage is basically that piece of cartilage at the ends of the epiphysis or the ends of the bones that articulate with the next bone next to it. And the reason for this is because if two bones rubbed together, they would cause a lot of friction, which would lead to pain and damage. So we have to put a little bit of cushion between those two bones. So your articular cartilage is there to provide the cushion between each bone. Here's another image of some bone anatomy if you want to pause here and look at it. Next, let's talk about bone tissue. As I mentioned before already, your bone tissue is actually alive in your body just like everything else and is composed of cells. So first we have osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are bone-forming cells, or the way I like to remember it, osteoblast is bone-building cells, B for building. They build up your bone cells within your body and are able to form new bone. Next, you have your osteoclast, and your osteoclast are there to absorb bone tissue during growth and healing, or are often known as what breaks down your bone. So think of break, C, osteoclast, okay? So osteoblast build bone or form new bone. Osteoclast absorb bone tissue or break down your bones. Osteocytes is just the name for a mature bone cell. Ossification is the process of bone hardening. So once a bone has reached its complete length and growth and it's not going to grow anymore, typically after you reach puberty, then your bones start to harden in place, or your bone cells start to harden in place so that they no longer are going to grow. And that process is called ossification. And then we're also going to be talking about your fontanelles in this class. Your fontanelle is a space between the bones of the skulls between birth and the age of 1. So here on the image, you can see that anterior fontanelle over here. Where's my mouse? There we go. Anterior fontanelle right here. Anterior just meaning that it's on the front of the skull, and fontanelle meaning that it is a space. When you're a baby, your brain is not completely formed or developed yet, and it has not reached its full size, and neither has your skull bones. And so you need to be able to adjust and grow as needed. And so you actually have that fontanelle there to allow for some more growth and development after birth. Next, we're going to talk about surface structures of the bones. I'm going to touch on this very briefly because we are not going to go too in depth on this in this class, but it's important to know if you were to ever take an anatomy class or something later on in college, you're definitely going to need to know all of these. The first thing I want to point out is that bone is not perfectly smooth. Even though sometimes you might look at a skeleton in the classroom and see that, it looks pretty smooth, really there are tons of projections, grooves, and depressions on that bone that do a lot of different things. Projections are what act as points of attachment for things like your muscles, your ligaments, or tendons. If your bone was perfectly smooth, those things would not be able to attach to the bone very well. Then you have grooves and depressions, which act as kind of pathways, channels, or tunnels for your nerves and your blood vessels. So you have lots of different types of bone structures on your bone, but we're not going to go too in depth on that. So how do your bones develop over time? As you can see in this picture, you have that initial foundation when you are being conceived, and then you have your developing periosteum. Remember, your periosteum is that layer that goes around the outer surface of bones. Then we start to see the beginning of compact bone formation and your primary ossification region being in the center of the bone. Then you see blood vessel development and eventually secondary ossification regions, which are on the ends of the bone, which will eventually ossify after puberty. And we also see the development of that medullary cavity. Eventually, over time, more compact bone is formed around it, and your epiphyseal growth plate is developed. This growth plate is the actual part of the bone that grows and expands as you age. And then lastly, when you see a mature bone, we see lots of compact bone and spongy bone. You see the bone marrow running through the center of it, and then on the ends, we start to develop that articular cartilage. Now we're going to be actually going into the sections where we learn about the different bones of the body. So we're going to start by dividing the skeleton into two parts, axial and appendicular. First, we're going to be talking about your axial skeleton, which are all the parts highlighted in blue on your screen. Your axial skeleton involves things like your skull, your spine, your sternum, your ribs, and basically everything from here to here minus your shoulders and arms. Okay, now we're going to be talking about your skull and facial bones. Your skull and facial bones are actually made of many different pieces that are all fused together by sutures. First, let's look at the skull. So here we have, from the side view, you can see you have many different parts. First, you have your frontal bone. Your frontal bone is this blue bone on the front of mine right here, and it's on the front of your face, makes up your forehead. Then you turn it to the side and you can see you have this big, large section that takes up a majority of the skull, and that is your parietal bone. If you look down on the side over here, we have your temporal bone, and many of you have probably heard of your temples before, and that's that area right here on the side of your head where sometimes you get a headache if you're stressed out. That's where your temporal bone is located. And then next you have your occipital bone, which is this piece here that covers the back of the skull, okay? Those are your four primary skull bones: the frontal bone, parietal bone, temporal bone, and occipital bone. Then you also have important things like your maxilla and your mandible. So your maxilla is this piece here, kind of where your upper lip is, your maxilla, and it goes a little bit onto the sides of your nose. And then you have your mandible, which is your actual jawbone. So the part that actually hinges is your mandible. On the front of your face, you can also see all of your facial bones. So you have a sphenoid bone, which you can see here is on the side of your face, kind of between the frontal and parietal bones. I'm going to try to show you in here. It's this pink piece right here. So we have our frontal, our parietal, temporal. Sphenoid is this pink section right there. You also have your nasal bone, which actually covers just the bridge of your nose, your nasal bone. You have your zygomatic bone. Your zygomatic bones on my mannequin are these purplish blue pieces right here. These are what you would call your cheekbones, your zygomatic bone. Your vomer is a really tiny bone located on the inside of your nose. On this one, it is green. Not sure if you can see that. Yep, there you go, vomer. And then your maxilla and your mandible, we've already covered, maxilla and mandible. And then, of course, your teeth are also bones, but you know where those are located. Okay, we've had to move locations because I'm going to use my skeleton here to show you a few things. But first, we're going to be talking about our ribs. So part of your axial skeleton are both your ribs and your sternum. And you have a few different sections of ribs. You have your true ribs, your false ribs, and your floating ribs. Your true ribs are the first 7 ribs that actually directly connect to your sternum here. So the first 7 that connect directly to the sternum are considered your true ribs. Then we move on to our false ribs, and our false ribs are these 3 down here that actually connect into a piece of cartilage that then connects up to the sternum. So your false ribs do not have their own pathway. They have to fuse together and then connect up to the sternum. And then you have your floating ribs, which are down here. You have 2 sets of them. And your floating ribs do not connect to your sternum at all. So you have your true ribs, your false ribs, and your floating ribs. Okay, next we're going to be talking about the spinal column. Your spinal column, again, is composed of many different sets of bones fused together. So we're going to remember our number of bones in each category by our meal times. So let's start off with our cervical vertebrae. Your cervical vertebrae are these top 7 vertebrae up here. And you can remember 7 because you eat breakfast at 7. So cervical are at the top, and there are 7 of them. Next, you have your thoracic vertebrae, and your thoracic vertebrae is where that thoracic cavity is. And we have 12 of them. And the best way to remember that is that you eat lunch at 12. And then down here in your lower back, you have your lumbar vertebrae, lower back, lumbar. And you have 5 of these, and you can remember that by remembering you eat dinner at 5. Maybe that's a little early, but close enough. And then even further down, which I can't show you on my model here, is your sacrum. And your sacrum is 5 vertebrae that are actually fused together. And then you have your coccyx, which are 4 really tiny bones known as your tailbone, which are also fused together. Okay, I'm back to my desk now. So next we have your hyoid bone. And your hyoid bone is a kind of unique bone because it is not actually attached to any other bone in the body. And it's located right above where your Adam's apple would be located. The skeleton in my classroom actually does have a hyoid bone, but because it's up under the jaw, I couldn't really get a good picture or video of it. But just know that your hyoid bone is the one bone in your body that's considered like a floating bone because it doesn't attach to anything. Okay, next we have your appendicular skeleton. So remember I said that your skeleton is kind of divided into two categories, axial and appendicular. Axial was the blue section on that image on the screen. Now we're talking about appendicular, which is the beige or kind of off-white section. And your appendicular skeleton involves things like your legs, your shoulders, your pelvic girdle, and your arms. The first thing we're going to be talking about with our appendicular skeleton is the shoulder girdle. And the shoulder girdle actually involves not only just the shoulders, but the arms as well. So on your shoulder girdle, first you have your clavicles. Most of you can probably feel for your own clavicles or even see them sticking out right here. Your clavicles are those two thin, long bones that go across the front of your chest. Here they are on our skeleton. These are the clavicles. Next, we have our scapula. I'm going to rotate him around. Your scapula is what you know of as your shoulder blades. So this right here is your scapula. I'm going to rotate him back around. Next, we have our humerus, which is this long bone here that is our upper arm. It runs all the way from the shoulder down to our elbows. Next, we have our radius. And your radius is on your thumb side. Here we go. Your radius is on your thumb side. So on our little skeleton dude, here is his thumb. So that means the radius is this bone right here. Radius is on your thumb side. So on your own arm, here's my thumb, my radius would be here. And then you have a second bone in your lower arm called your ulna, and your ulna is on your pinky side. Okay? Ulna, radius. So again, on our little skeleton man, we have thumb side, radius, pinky side, ulna. Then in your hands, you have carpals. So all of these little tiny, tiny bones right in here are your carpals. Okay? Each carpal does actually have a name, but I'm not going to make you remember the names of all the carpals for this class. But if you were to ever take an anatomy class or a higher level college course, you will have to know all of those. But just know that these bones right in here are your carpals. Next, we have our metacarpals. And your metacarpals are the bones that make up the majority of your hand. So they connect your carpals to your phalanges, and they're these long bones right here, metacarpals. So in your hand, they would be right here. And then lastly, you have your phalanges, and your phalanges is just a fancy word for your fingers. So these are your phalanges. Now your phalanges are actually made of a few bones fused together, which is why we have knuckles. So your phalanges are not straight or one fused bone, because if they were, we wouldn't be able to grip anything. So you actually have multiple bones in here, but they make up your phalanges. Okay, next we're going to be talking about your pelvic girdle, and your pelvic girdle includes things like your pelvic bones, your hips, your legs, all the way down to your toes and your feet. So first we're going to be starting with your ilium, ischium, and pubis. Your ilium, ischium, and pubis all make up what is known as your pelvic bone or your hip bones. So I'm going to crouch down here. So here we have our hip bones. Up here, this big, flat, wide part is the ilium. Down here, this part, these two pieces that look like they connect together, these two pieces are your pubis bone. And then down here, you have two pieces that kind of loop around on the back, and these are your ischium. So you have your ilium, pubis, and ischium. Okay? Next, we also have our femur and our patella. So your femur is actually the upper part of your leg or your thigh bone. So this is your femur. It's the longest bone in the body, and it's the one that supports the most of our body weight. Here we have our skeleton's knee, and as you can see where the femur ends and it joins up with your tibia, we have this little tiny rock looking bone here on the front of the knee. That is your patella, or also known as your kneecap. Then on your lower half of your leg, you have your tibia, which is this big piece here. It's another one of the largest bones in the body, is your tibia. And then your fibula, which is a thinner secondary bone that runs parallel to it. Your tibia, your fibula. Then in your foot, you have a very similar orientation that you do to your hands, which is that you have tarsals. So where your carpals would be in your hand, you have tarsals in your foot. You have your metatarsals, which make up a majority of your foot. And then you have your phalanges again on the end. So your phalanges are just your toes. And remember, they're not one bone fused together, but made of multiple bones held together by different joints. So your tarsals, metatarsals, and phalanges are very similar to the carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges of your hand. And then your calcaneus is just a fancy name for your heel bone. Okay, that is it for the bones of the body. The last thing we're going to be touching on today is your cartilage. So your cartilage is actually connective tissue that can withstand way more amount of flexing and tension and pressure than your bones can. And this is typically found in things like your nose and your ears, in between bones, and your flexible connection between bones or between ribs and your sternum. This is important because it allows for chest flexion during breathing, and also if we were to have to perform CPR. Your cartilage also acts as a cushion between bones called articular cartilage, which we talked about earlier, and this is located on the ends of your long bones and kind of act as a shock absorber or prevent grinding. And then you also have bursa on the ends of your bones, which are small sacs that secrete a lubricant fluid called synovial fluid. And occasionally these bursa can actually become inflamed or infected, and you have a condition called bursitis. Osteoarthritis is a fancy name for the inflammation of the bone and joints, which is what we get older in age after we've been using our cartilage and our bones for a long period of time. After a lot of use, they can become inflamed or infected, and so we end up with osteoarthritis, which means it's very difficult for us to open and close our hands, or maybe we have pain in our knees or our hips. Okay, that is it. So hopefully you found this helpful, that I was able to show you like some of our real life models as well as the pictures on the screen. Make sure that you do pause and you go back and you take notes, and that you use the skeletal system flashcards that I have provided on Quizlet. They allow you to like match the different bones to their names and things like that. And I'm also going to be posting a magnetic skeletal system review video as well. So if you have any questions, as always, feel free to text me on Remind or email me, and I will see you all later.